Nobody stopped the girl dragging blue barrels behind the milk shed. Not the first day. Not the second. By the time June heat settled over Harper's Fork, Maren Cole had lined up 11 of them beneath the back gutter of her father's barn. Pickle drums, feed tubs, a cracked horse trough, one old galvanized wash basin with a dent in the side. She set them in a crooked row behind the equipment lean-to, where the road couldn't see them. Then she started connecting them with pipe. Her father asked once what she was building. Maren said, "A place for the rain to wait." Ben Cole thought she was being 12. He was wrong. Harper's Fork lay in the Ozark folds of Stone County, Missouri, where limestone ridges lifted out of the fields and the creek beds could run clear in April, then rattle dry by August. The Cole place covered 72 acres if you counted the hill pasture, the hay ground, the garden plot, and the old orchard planted on the slope behind the house. It was not a large farm. It was the kind of farm that survived by wasting almost nothing. Ben kept beef cattle, cut hay when the weather let him, and sold peaches, pears, and blackberries from a roadside stand under a tin roof. His wife, Lila, kept the accounts in a green ledger and could tell by Tuesday morning whether Saturday market money had been good or just looked good. Maren had an older brother named Eli, 16, who cared more about football than irrigation lines. She had a younger sister, June 8, who followed her around with 2 braids, muddy knees, and the absolute belief that Maren knew how everything worked. And across the yard, in a converted smokehouse with a porch just big enough for one chair, lived her grandfather, Amos Cole. Amos was 81 years old, nearly deaf in one ear, and still kept rainfall records in pencil. He had notebooks going back to 1969. Every storm, every dry spell, every creek flood, every August when the pasture burned brown before Labor Day. He did not write beautifully. He wrote like a man putting nails into wood, short lines, hard numbers, no decoration. But Maren loved those notebooks. They were proof that the weather had a memory, even when people didn't. The trouble began in the second dry spring. The first dry year had made everyone careful. The second one made people quiet. By late April, the upper orchard soil had turned the color of ash. When Ben pressed his boot heel into it, the ground did not dent. It cracked. The young peach trees on the west slope were curling first, their leaves folding inward like tired hands. The wells still worked. That was the part that made the worry worse. It worked just enough to keep a man hoping. The pump groaned longer each week before the first water hit the pipe. The lower cattle tank took nearly 17 minutes to fill, when the year before it had taken 9. Ben stopped watering the garden from the farm line. Then he stopped washing equipment. Then he started choosing which trees got water and which ones had to wait. Maren walked the rows with him one evening and watched him pour 2 coffee cans of water at the base of every third tree. Not every tree, every third. She didn't ask why. She already knew what counting looked like when there wasn't enough. The county extension man came out in May. His name was Russell Vane. He wore a sweat-stained cap, carried a soil probe in the back of his truck, and had the careful voice of someone who had delivered bad news to too many farm kitchens. He took samples on the slope. He checked the wellhead. He studied the pump log that Lila had started keeping on the refrigerator with a magnet from the feed store. Then he told Ben what nobody wanted to hear. "You can drill deeper," he said. "Maybe 40 feet, maybe 60. Or you can haul water until the weather breaks." Ben looked toward the orchard. "How much?" Russell rubbed the dust between his fingers. "More than you want." Maren was sitting on the porch steps, quiet enough that the grown-ups forgot she was there. That was one of her gifts. People mistook quiet for not listening. As Russell closed his tailgate, Maren asked, "How much rain lands here in a normal year?" Russell paused. "On this farm? On this roof?" She pointed at the barn. He looked at the long tin roof, then back at her. "Well," he said, "1 inch of rain on 1 square foot is a little over half a gallon. Your barn roof is what, 1,600 square feet? A decent storm could throw 1,000 gallons off that roof." Maren waited. "Then why don't we have it?" Russell didn't laugh. That was to his credit. He only looked at the gutter, then the ditch where roof water cut a muddy track every spring, then the creek bed that carried it away. "Because nobody caught it," he said. That sentence stayed with her longer than anything else he said. Because nobody caught it. The rain had been falling on the Cole barn since Maren's great-grandfather nailed the first tin sheets into place. It had run down the roof, through the gutters, over the broken splash stones, into the yard ditch, then out toward Turkey Creek. Gone before supper. Gone the way loose change disappears when nobody thinks to pick it up. That night, Maren took Amos's oldest rainfall notebook to the kitchen table. She opened it beside one of Russell's extension pamphlets, the kind printed on thin paper with diagrams of downspouts and storage tanks. The pamphlet smelled like dust and old cabinets. The math inside was plain: roof area, rainfall depth, runoff, storage. Maren copied the formula onto the back of a grocery receipt. 1,680 square feet of barn roof, 1 inch of rain, roughly 1,000 gallons, even after waste. She ran it 3 times because she did not trust good news the first time it arrived. The number stayed the same. The farm was not only losing water in the well, it was throwing water away from the sky. The next morning, Maren started collecting barrels. She got the first 2 from behind Pickett's feed, where they had once held mineral supplement and smelled faintly of molasses. Mr. Pickett made her promise she was not going to roll herself down a hill in one of them. She promised. She got 3 more from a pickle packing shed outside Crane, washed them with dish soap until her arms ached, and rinsed them with water she felt guilty using. She found a cracked horse trough behind a neighbor's machine shop. She bought a bundle of used PVC pipe for $18 from a man whose wife wanted it out of their garage. The fittings cost more. Maren paid for them with money she had saved from selling blackberries the summer before. $47 in a coffee can under her bed. It had been bicycle money. June watched her count it out and said, "You're not getting your bike?" Maren closed the coffee can. Not first. What she built behind the milk shed was ugly. There was no better word for it. Blue barrels, white pipe, black rubber couplings, a tilted trough sealed with roofing tar, a gutter elbow cut too short on one side because Maren had measured it once, not twice. Eli called it her trash aquarium. Maren did not answer him. Her mother stood at the kitchen window one afternoon and watched Maren dig a shallow trench with a narrow spade, sweat darkening the back of her shirt. Lila asked Ben, "Do you think we should stop her?" Ben looked out at his daughter, then at the orchard behind her. "She's not hurting anything." That was not encouragement, but it was permission. Maren took it. The first storm came hard on the last Sunday in May. It rolled over the ridge after dark, with thunder low enough to shake the window glass and rain, striking the tin roof like thrown gravel. Maren ran to the back porch in her socks. For the first 10 minutes it was beautiful. Water poured down the gutter, hit the elbow, and rushed into the first barrel, exactly the way the pamphlet said it would. The barrel filled so fast Maren almost laughed. Then the first coupling bulged. Then the second pipe twisted. Then the whole lower joint blew loose and sent water spraying across the yard like a busted fire hose. Half the storm ran into the same ditch as always. Maren stood there in the rain, soaked through, watching the farm lose what she had promised herself she would save. Her father came to the porch door. "Maren, morning will do." But morning would not show her the failure. So she stayed. She watched the water jump the bad joint. She watched where the pipe sagged. She watched the overflow fight gravity because she had set the barrels too level. By the time she went inside, Her teeth were chattering, but she knew what had gone wrong. That mattered. The next day after school, she tore out half the system. She rebuilt the line with rigid pipe. She stacked the first barrel higher on concrete blocks. She dropped each connection a little lower than the one before it, letting gravity do what tape and hope could not. She clamped the joints with metal bands instead of wire. Amos watched from his chair outside the smokehouse. After an hour, he said, "Water is lazy." Maren looked up. "It takes the easiest road," he said. "So give it the road you want." That was all. Then he went back to his coffee. The second storm came 11 days later. The pipe held, the barrels filled, the trough held until sometime after midnight, when the tar seam Maren had rushed split open along the bottom edge. By morning, the water level had dropped more than a foot. 200 gallons were gone, sunk into dry dirt under the trough. This time, Maren did not cry. That would have been easier. She knelt beside the emptying tank and pressed her thumb against the black seam, feeling the soft place where the seal had never cured right. Amos came out in his slippers. He looked at the leak. Then he looked at her hands. "Seal it twice," he said. "Let it sit a full week." "A week? If you can't wait on tar," Amos said, "you can't save water." So Maren waited. That was the hardest work she did all spring. Not hauling barrels, not digging, waiting. She sealed every seam twice. She sealed the inside corners. She sealed the outside corners. She brushed tar into cracks so small she had to find them by touch. Then she wrote the curing date on a strip of tape and stuck it to the trough. "Do not fill until June 18. Every day she checked it. Every day she wanted to test it. Every day she walked away. The third rain came soft, almost apologetic, just before sunrise on June 19. No thunder, no drama, only steady water tapping down the tin roof and slipping into the system. Maren stood behind the milk shed in her boots and watched the first barrel fill, then the second, then the third. The pipe stayed locked. The trough stayed dark and still at the seams. Nothing burst, nothing leaked. By breakfast, she had caught more water than the orchard line could pump in 3 days. Ben came out with his coffee and stood beside her. He did not say he was proud, not then. Men like Ben Cole often needed time to admit when a child had just handed them an answer. He only asked, "How much do you think is in there?" "If the trough's full," Maren said, "about 1,400 gallons altogether." Ben took a slow breath. The orchard sat above them in the pale morning light, its leaves curled but still alive. "Show me the numbers," he said. "That changed everything. Not all at once. Real change on a farm rarely arrives with music. It arrives with a man reaching for a pencil." Maren brought him Amos's notebook, Russell's pamphlet, and the grocery receipt with her math on the back. Ben sat at the kitchen table while Leela poured coffee and Amos leaned against the doorframe, listening. Maren explained the roof area. She explained the runoff. She explained why the first pipe failed, why the trough leaked, and why waiting a full week had mattered. Ben did not interrupt. That was how Maren knew he was really listening. Then he took the pencil and added one number she had missed. The machine shed roof. Another 900 square feet. "Could catch that too," he said. Maren tried not to smile too quickly. "Yes," she said, "we could. By July." The creek was a string of shallow pools between white stones. Pastures across the fork went dull brown. Hayfields that should have stood waist-high came up thin and brittle. Neighbors started talking about selling calves early. The price of hauled water climbed because everyone needed it at the same time. Ben still used the well for the cattle, but the young orchard trees were Maren's responsibility now. Every evening, after the heat came down but before dark, she carried water uphill in 2 5-gallon buckets. June carried 1/2 full bucket and spilled enough to grow weeds along the path. Neither of them mentioned it. They poured water slowly at the roots. Not on the leaves, not over the crusted ground where it would run away. At the roots. Maren had learned that from watching her father count. The first week, it felt foolish. 2 girls carrying buckets against a drought that covered half the county. The second week, the foolishness began to look like a system. The younger peach trees stopped curling. The blackberry canes stayed green at the base. The pears looked tired, but not dead. Across the road, the Henson orchard dropped fruit the size of marbles. At the Cole place, the hills still had color. That was when people stopped teasing. First it was Eli. He came home from football practice one afternoon, saw Maren carrying water up the slope, and took one of the buckets without being asked. He acted like he was only doing it because she looked slow. Maren let him keep that story. Then it was Ben. On a Saturday morning, he brought out the ladder, a new downspout, and a clean length of pipe from the hardware store. He and Maren ran a second line off the machine shed roof, feeding 2 more barrels into the system. They worked for 4 hours in the heat. Ben measured, Maren cut. Ben held the pipe while Maren tightened the clamp. At one point he said, "You know why I didn't think of it?" Maren shook her head. "Because I kept looking down the well." He tapped the gutter with the back of his knuckles. "You were looking at what was leaving." That was the closest thing to an apology Maren was going to get. It was enough. The person who had laughed loudest was Cal Rucker. Cal farmed the next ridge over, ran more cattle than Ben did, and had a way of making every opinion sound like common sense. He had seen the barrels in June and told 2 men at the diner that Ben's girl was trying to save the Ozarks in pickle buckets. By late July, Cal's spring-fed pond had dropped so low his cows stood in mud up to their ankles. He came to the Cole farm in a dust-covered truck and did not laugh when he got out. He looked at the orchard first. Then he looked at the barrels. Then he looked at Maren. "How much did all this cost you?" Maren wiped her hands on her jeans. "Before Dad helped, $65, not counting tar." Cal stared at the pipe. "And it works." Maren pointed to the watermark inside the trough. "It works if you don't rush the seals." Cal said nothing for a moment. Men who laugh first often need extra time when they come back to ask for help. Finally he said, "Could you draw it out for me?" Maren nodded. She did more than draw it. She walked him through the whole system. Barrel height, pipe slope, overflow trench, filter screen over the first downspout to keep leaves from clogging the elbow. She showed him the repair where the first coupling had blown apart. She showed him the double seal where the trough had failed. She did not hide the mistakes. That made Cal listen harder. By the time he left, he had borrowed Russell's pamphlet and promised to bring it back clean. He brought it back 2 days later with 3 neighbors' names written on the corner. Russell Vane returned in August, not because Ben called, because Cal did. The extension man walked around the back of the milk shed with a clipboard, but after a few minutes he stopped pretending this was only a farm visit. He asked Maren where the first failure happened. He asked how much drop she had between barrels. He asked what she used to seal the trough. He took pictures of the gutter line, the concrete blocks, the overflow ditch, and Amos's notebook opened to a page from 1980, when a dry June had broken under 2 storms in 12 days. Russell stood there longer than Maren expected. Finally he said, "You know what this is?" Maren looked at the barrels. "Ugly." Russell smiled. "Cheap enough that people might actually do it." That sentence mattered too, because the story was never that Maren invented rainwater. People had been catching rain for as long as people had roofs. The story was that everyone around her had started treating old answers like they were too small to matter. A deeper well sounded serious. A water truck sounded serious. A loan from the bank sounded serious. A row of used barrels behind a milk shed sounded childish until it kept trees alive. But seriousness is not measured by how expensive the answer looks. Sometimes it is measured by whether the answer reaches the roots. By September, The Cole orchard did not look untouched. That would be a lie. Some leaves burned at the edges. 2 young peach trees never recovered. The blackberry rose gave less than a good year and more than a bad one. But the pears held, the older peaches held, and when the apples came in, they came in small, sweet, and stubborn, enough to fill bushel baskets, enough for Lila to reopen the roadside stand, enough for Ben to stop running drilling numbers at midnight. The farm had not escaped the drought. It had answered part of it. There is a difference. That fall, Amos gave Maren one of his rainfall notebooks. Not a copy, an original. It was the brown one from 1976 through 1984, the years when Ben had been a boy, and Amos had nearly lost the lower pasture to 3 bad summers in a row. Maren held it like it was a family Bible. "I can't take this," she said. "You already did," Amos told her. "You just started using it." After that, the notebooks moved from the smokehouse to the kitchen shelf. Lila began adding water levels beside egg sales and market totals. Ben built a better stand for the trough. Not because Maren asked, but because he said the first one looked like it had survived a tornado. Eli welded a frame for the filter screen in shop class and acted like it was nothing. June painted the first barrel with white letters that said, "Rain Money." The paint ran a little. No one fixed it. By the next spring, 3 farms in Harper's Fork had catchment barrels tucked behind barns. Cal Rucker had 6 of them, lined up straighter than Maren's ever were, and he told anybody who visited that the slope had to be right or the whole thing was just yard art. He said it like he had known it forever. Maren let him. She turned 13 that winter. On her birthday, Ben bought her the bicycle anyway, a used one, red, with one handlebar grip missing. Maren rode it twice around the yard, then parked it beside the milk shed and spent the rest of the afternoon helping Amos copy rainfall totals into a new notebook. The sky over Harper's Fork did not become kinder after that. There were still dry weeks, still pump troubles, still mornings when Ben walked the orchard with his jaw tight, reading leaves the way other men read bills. But something in the Cole family had changed. Not the weather, not the soil, not the cost of drilling. The change was smaller and harder to see. They had stopped calling a thing useless just because it had always been wasted. The rain still hit the barn roof. It still ran down the tin in silver sheets. It still tried to leave the farm the same way it had left for generations. Only now, behind the milk shed, blue barrels waited beneath the gutter. And when the first storm of April came over the ridge, Maren stood under the eave with Amos beside her, listening as the roof began to speak. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, like something finally being counted. The sky had not become more generous. A child had simply stopped letting the farm throw its own water away.